This module looks at women's roles within and treatment by the world's major religions. So first and foremost, what we see is that women in general tend to be more religious and have stronger religious views than men. This is especially true among Christian populations, as you can see here in the figure. But these gender gaps are less consistent among Muslim communities. Now, religion itself can be a source of empowerment for women. The sorts of inequalities that are based on gender, race, class, and sexuality tend to be seen as incompatible with what might be considered a just or loving God. The leadership of and participation in important rituals can strengthen a woman's place within religion, and their participation also allows them to contest the poor treatment using certain passages from Scripture. Religion can also, however, be seen as a source of oppression for women. Religions are often agents of gender inequality and sexual, or at least they can be agents of gender inequality and sexual oppression. Patriarchy is presented as inevitable and correct. The creation story has been used to persecute the LGBTQ+ community, and very often religious texts are manipulated in order to oppress women. When it comes down to a comparison of empowerment versus repression, this depends on the religion itself, the gender inequality within the society, and then finally the self-reinforcing system, or the recursive link between these two factors. And so what we're seeing in these two figures here is along the bottom axis, these are from higher to lower, the amount of gender inequality within the society. And then on the y-axis on the left-hand side are lower to higher levels of religious restrictions. So what you should be seeing is that the higher levels of gender inequality within a society, the higher the amounts of religious restrictions that are put in place. And so zooming in on these two figures, what we're seeing is the figure on the right is actually just a zoomed in portion of the figure on the left, showing you the countries and societies within the upper right hand corner. So those that have the highest restrictions in terms of their religion and the highest levels of gender inequality. Women are very often given greater roles in less widespread or indigenous religions. These tend to incorporate strong female mythological figures, and there's no doctrine of male dominance. Some examples of this include Afro-Brazilian religion, in which is a combination of African tribal religion, Amerindian, Catholicism, and Carticism. They are often involved in curing and public rituals with female mediums possessed by spirits. Another example is Black Carib religion. These are rituals that are conducted to honor and appease ancestral spirits and to protect the living against evil spirits and sorcery. Old women in these societies tend to be the spiritual leaders. And finally, Korean household religion, which we talked a little bit about in the other lecture for this module, dealing with shamanism. Women in their homes, though, actually make offerings to the gods as well for the well-being of their households, or they go and visit female shamans for this purpose. An example of one such indigenous mythology actually comes to us from Australia, amongst the Aboriginal communities there. What you see here on the slide is the creation myth of the Karora. And what you're noticing is that as you read it, that Yi, this figure that you see depicted on the left, is actually a female deity, and she is the one who is tapped to create society, to create humans, and eventually to create all the animals as well. Now when it comes to religious fundamentalism in women, the fundamentalist religions tend to be committed to the authority of ancient scripture and belief that they are infallible. They hold religion to provide a total worldview that is inseparable from politics. They tend to idealize a past when gender spheres were completely separate. They often require women to be modest, subordinates, and regulate their sexuality. And lastly, they reject norms of human universal rights and multiculturalism. What we tend to see is what's called benevolent sexism. And so this is sort of plays out as a protective paternalism. We see there's what's considered to be complementary gender differentiation, but it's very strict heterosexual intimacy only. Now, this can lead to, making gender inequality seem as if it's just a chivalrous act. It appears to celebrate women's traditional roles and presents these traditional roles as religious imperatives. However, if this goes too far, what it can turn into is something called hostile sexism. And this is when women are seen as enemies and temptresses. They threaten men's religious study, and they really just need to be controlled. Now, your textbook talks a bit about how we can deconstruct patriarchal religions, focusing on the four issues that you see listed here on the screen. So let's take a closer look at a couple of these. The first being masculine God language. So this tends to arise from the patriarchal historical context within which these world religions developed. However, this sort of language tends to deify male power. So males are seen as being more godlike. This also leads to leadership and family decisions being considered a male domain, so women's opinions are not considered in such matters. And in the end, it just grounds female subordination within the divine. An example of this is a study by McMinn et al. From 1993, where they looked cross-culturally and found that when God is depicted as male, he is viewed in that society as being powerful. But on the other hand, when God is seen as female, she is seen as merciful. So you're seeing here just the dichotomy in perspectives of how a god could be gendered, and then how that would be interpreted and understood within different societies. Another one of these ways we can deconstruct patriarchal religions is through gender-segregated religious practice. So what we tend to find is that male religious practices are public. They occur in churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques. Men take on leadership roles within religion, and they have unrestricted access to religious texts. Now, on the other hand, female religious practices tend to be more private. They occur in the household. Women are responsible for preparing ritual and religious holiday meals. They prepare children for religious services. And they, however, have restricted access to religious texts. Moving on from this, what we can do to help us reconstruct patriarchal religions comes down to the four tasks you see here. We can seek to use inclusive God and prayer language. We need to use religious texts and history to promote gender equality. We need to increase the number of women in religious leadership and promote women's theological literacy. And all of these things together can help to have women have a fuller participation and benefit from their participation in these world religions. So let's take a look at least a few of the examples, not everything, because your textbook goes over these as well. The first being Judaism. The largest populations of Jewish communities occur in Israel, Europe, and the US. Their sacred texts are the Torah and the Talmud. And there are many different movements within Judaism. So Orthodox Judaism, ultra-Orthodox Judaism, which are the more fundamentalist sects, and then Reconstructionist Judaism, which are much more progressive practitioners nowadays. So is Judaism the world's most sexist religion? Well, we do see that it has masculine God language. There are very few female images. We actually have some examples here from the textbook of sexism from the Torah or the Talmud. This one I scoffed a bit myself, was the men's daily morning prayer. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has not made me a woman. Well, I would say the opposite is true for myself. Anyway, we also learn about the sort of suffering that women have to endure, and this actually goes all the way back to the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Eve was the one who took the apple off the tree and committed the first original sin that we're all having to pay the price for since then. When it comes to Orthodox Judaism and women, we see quite a few gender-segregated practices. So the spiritual domain is seen as male, whereas the household domain is female. They're responsible for the ritual purity of the home, keeping things kosher. They're required to take a ritual bath 7 days after their menstruation. And they're the organizers and facilitators of these sort of home-centered religious holidays. So the dinner for Shabbat, for example, and also the Sabbath. Women are segregated from men within the synagogue as well, with the services actually being conducted on the men's side of this separation. Women don't count towards the quorum of 10 that are needed for public religious services. Ordination and prayer leading is forbidden to women. And in some communities, or some women tend to use what's called the tichel or the sheitel, which is a headscarf or wig that they wear to cover their hair for modesty purposes. There are some Jewish feminists out there, though, tend to be non-Orthodox reformists. They're attempting to replace this masculine religious language. So instead of saying, let us bless the they're encouraging people to use, let us bless the source of life, instead of Lord our God, King of the universe. They're also pushing for the inclusion of Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel as names to be added to the names of the forefathers in the text. If you've never read the book, The Red Tent, I cannot remember the author's name right now, but it's actually a really fascinating read. It's pretty historically accurate, but it is historical fiction in terms of telling these sort of stories of Joseph and his wives from the perspective of the wives. Anyway, I recommend it. Jewish feminists are also trying to replace the story of Lilith as a demon and first wife of Adam, and using it as a story for empowerment. So I didn't actually know this, but apparently in some of the texts, Adam had a wife who was made from the same clay as him originally. She, however, decided to leave on her own, and that was when God came through and made Eve as the new second wife for Adam, from his flesh, from his rib, and therefore was made as a subordinate to him. All right, let's take a look at Hinduism. Now, this is a religion that's primarily practiced within India. It's roughly 6,000 years old. It's one of the only major polytheistic religions in the world, and it has no primary founder or prophet. The Vedas are the major texts, so that's where we look for depictions and descriptions of how the women's roles and treatment. And in this religion, local customs are very important because there's lots of variability in the practice of it. There are several female goddesses in Hinduism, and these become great sources of power for women. The first being Durga, who rules strength and protection. She is seen as a supreme being. Sarasvati is the goddess of learning. Lakshmi is the goddess of prosperity. And finally, Kali is the goddess of time, creation, destruction, and power. And she's a very scary sort of creature, but is a great source for women, as I said. When it comes to fundamentalist Hinduism, it too promotes gender inequality. Female goddesses are seen as dangerously passionate, capable of giving and taking life. This is especially true for Kali, who we saw on the last slide. Therefore, there's a need for control by the male gods so that the female goddesses don't produce chaos. Unmarried goddesses are more likely to be seen as dangerous, whereas married goddesses are held as models for women. So some of these, including Savitri, who devoted herself to her husband Brahma and actually ended up sacrificing her life for his. The highest religious duty within fundamentalist Hinduism, though, is given to the husband. And as wives, you can be a loyal wife, and that's the best way to promote good karma within your life and your husband's life. There are a few other fundamentalist practices within Hinduism. Husband devotion, as I was just talking about. Sati is another pretty extreme example. Hindu wives sometimes end their lives by throwing themselves on the husband's funeral pyre. This is a practice that was outlawed during British colonialism, but there are still documented cases of this on occasion nowadays. And then lastly, purdah, which is that women must stay indoors and segregated from men other than their husband and sons, and then that they have to be veiled while they're in public. When it comes to women in Hindu ritual, they tend to participate and lead rituals within their homes. They do engage in public rituals on behalf of their family and their well-being. Hinduism does not borrow women priests, so the woman on the top figure here is actually a female priest. And the early texts actually suggest that women could receive religious education and perform ceremonies. Now, this has changed over time, with women that are now barred from study and entering temples in some parts of India. There are, however, though, Hindu women reformers. They are trying to return to those origins of Hinduism, in which women wrote hymns and performed rituals early on. This sort of transition to male-headed religious practice was helped by British colonialism. These reformers are drawing on stories of empowered goddesses. Draupadi is an epic figure who does not allow men to dictate to her, and again, the goddess Kali inspires both terror but also awe. And so I'm going to leave you with this passage that talks about the veneration of the divine female for your consideration. And